international programs these days at ABIS and leader of Work Package 8 in the EU-InnovatE research project, which is rapidly approaching its conclusion after 3 years of quite intensive activity, looking to questions around the role of user innovators, entrepreneurs, and citizens in driving progress towards more sustainable lifestyles in Europe by 2050. Pleased today to welcome you to the 5th series of international webinars we're running as part of the preparation for our final conference. A few on that at the end of today's webinar. But now I'm very pleased to give a quick run through of the agenda for today. I will take a few minutes to give a very quick introduction and context to the project as a whole. Then we will be moving swiftly on to the main presentation from Copenhagen Business School and Cranfield School of Management on policy innovation to support sustainable entrepreneurship and user innovation in Europe. We'll be hearing from alternately Christian Rode Nielsen in Copenhagen, Queen Mira Nielsen and Zena Watson in Cranfield. And given apocalyptic conditions that we have in Brussels today, I hope the weather is a great cheerier in your various locations than it is here. The presentation will have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and a slightly wider discussion. I'd also note that the webinar is being recorded for posterity and will be posted on the project website a few days after the end of this, once we've edited the files and tidied everything up. So, if we could move on to the next slide, please. I'd just like to very quickly take you through the background to sustainable lifestyles at the European level. Strategic policy objectives that basically laid the foundation for a project that we've been running for the last 3 years. So since 2010, the European Union and its agencies have been primarily concerned with 3 headline issues. How can you better promote smart, sustainable and inclusive growth in the single market, something which is increasingly difficult in very turbulent and volatile market conditions? That is how do you manage an aging population while reducing current levels of energy, transport and resource use? And that's how do we sustain societies? The first one more about sustaining economies. And the third is really about sustaining ecosystems, how we rethink consumption and production systems as a transition to a low-carbon economy by 2050. So in these areas, the European Union has some visions or blueprints or scenarios, but the key question is, how do you get there? On to the next slide, please. For the research project that we have, EU-InnovatE, is trying to answer some of these questions, or at least provide some more evidence for European policymakers on how to chart the pathways towards some of these scenarios and long-term futures. And the call for proposals focused on 4 main areas. The first is the linkages between different systems, ecological, human and technological, and how those actually shape and determine consumer values and behavior. One of the holy grails of the sustainability movement, one would argue. It was really around the obstacles and opportunities associated with the transition towards these scenarios on sustainable living and economy in Europe. What are going to be the key drivers or the barriers that have to be overcome, and what's the potential benefits of this transition being turned from an aspiration into a reality? The important part is really around the new ways and the new business models in particular that will transform these production consumption systems that we referred to earlier. An overall consequence of improving quality of life and well-being in Europe. Measurement, really understanding what sustainable lifestyles and green economy will look like and what kind of impacts they will have on the wider ecosystem in Europe up to 2050 based on what we understand about the macro trends that are shaping our reality today. Next, please. This is a quick view of the consortium that we brought together for the EU-InnovatE project. Technische Universität München, School of Management, under the leadership of Frank Martin Beltz, is in the middle as our scientific coordinator. You can see that we have a pan-European group of leading universities, business schools, and business academic networks who have been pursuing a wide range of activities to try and provide some answers to the European Commission in this area. Next. Work has really been framed by one central idea about investigating the creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial roles of users, entrepreneurs, in developing new sustainable products, services, and systems that taken together will liberate us toward these scenarios of sustainable living in Europe by 2050. A simple visualization of how we think this emerging phenomenon represents a big shift from perhaps the classic 20th century model of the role of users in product consumption systems and innovation more broadly. Only the last few decades of the 20th century were very much in the bottom left quadrant, with passive and individual users filling very conventional roles as consumers, but excluded from inner processes and new product and service design. But with the emergence of new technologies, new media, access to open data and the like, we're seeing what we do is a significant shift towards the upper right quadrant, where new technology platforms are empowering users to work together, just in communication platforms, but also in genuine innovative communities, therefore making the shift towards co-production of new products and services. Slide, please. This is a very quick overview of the design of the EU-InnovatE project. We've been looking at a number of different areas, including the historical development of sustainable lifestyles and systemic transitions in Europe. We have been looking very much to the future with scenarios through to 2050, led by Fund for the Future. We've invested a lot of time and energy looking at the way that large companies are increasingly opening their innovation system to user profiles and entrepreneurs, a way of rethinking how they innovate around their business model for sustainable outcomes. And we've been looking at the dynamics of these new user communities, the co-producers and the collective users starting to pioneer new ways of sustainable lifestyle solutions. One part of this has been around policy design, as the rule setters, the facilitators, the enablers, and often the financiers for innovation at an European level. And so thinking about the boundaries of innovation ecosystems. So today's webinar focuses on the policy dimension. I'm very pleased to hand the microphone over to our colleagues in Copenhagen and Cranfield. First to Christian Rød-Nielsen, who is also doing his PhD through the EU-InnovatE project. And he's going to kick us off with the main presentation around policymaking and innovation to support sustainable lifestyles and entrepreneurship in Europe. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can see you've already introduced the key speakers today, so I think maybe we should just jump into what exactly is it that we're talking about when we talk about user innovation or sustainable entrepreneurship. And often we use examples because there are many academic definitions of what it is. We'll also into that a little bit later, that user innovation has many facets and it is in some way hard to capture. But I think a great example of user innovation is the mountain bike. Basically, the mountain bike was not made by a firm that had spotted a gap in the market. It wasn't made by a research and development think tank, so to say, who came up with a novel idea. It was made by biking enthusiasts who basically wanted to take bike off-road and use it in other circumstances than in a paved road. And actually, when you do that, you need to change the construct of the bike, or else it's going to be quite uncomfortable. So what these enthusiasts did basically was that they took motorcycle components and made fat tires, they made shock absorbers, they changed the brake on it, and started to emerge was we know today as the mountain bike. But only these biking enthusiasts didn't do this with a commercial aim or an aim to make a lot of money. It was more that wanted to do something different with the materials they had. They could find anything in the market that suited their needs, so they decided to do it on their own. What emerged is the mountain bike. I know some of us have probably had a mountain bike through our childhood, and this, I think, is a great example of user-driven innovation, or what we could also call consumer innovation. It is kind of the end user is kind of the academic definition we have of it. But we could jump in the next slide and just see examples of this innovation. So basically what Work Package 6 looks at is, as Simon said, how could policy promote user innovation and sustainable entrepreneurship? And first things we stumble across is this idea of the active end user with innovation has many names. I mean, we've all heard in some regards maybe one of two of these: the idea of open source, the idea of co-creation, the idea of crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. There are many names for it, but in our heads and what we conceptualized when we started with it was that the idea that the end user was no longer a passive recipient of innovation, but was instead an active part of it. What does it mean in the context of policy? If we can jump to the next slide. Look at policy in general is aimed at big firms, it's aimed at incumbents, and until recently the idea that the user or that the consumer could innovate on its own was seen as a kind of an outside idea. It wasn't until the 1970s that it really started to get any kind of traction within academic discourse, and still when we look at policy in general, most policy is aimed at big emergent firms or aimed at changing consumer behavior, but not very much policy is focused on how can we actually engage the consumer to innovate their own sustainable solutions. So basically what Cranfield and CBS and also our other partners have tried to do. So if we jump to the next slide, please. What I tried to do was firstly look at what are the current policies and instruments out there? What has been discussed within the literature? What are some of the ideas that have been brought up? And are there differences between policies aimed at, for example, first versus policies that are aimed at the end user? And identified was that there definitely is a big difference between the benefits that end users or consumers face when innovating versus what a larger firm or company would face. And to the second point, we then tried to come up with some ideas of what are policies and instruments that could support this kind of consumer-driven innovation. What would be most effective and where would it come from? And then mainly, we basically had to see whether ideas that came from academic literature and of workshops that we had practice. So basically, if we engaged with end users and at this sustainable media-enabled conference that Cranfield did a great job hosting, what they say about the ideas that emerge, because sometimes there emerges a disconnect between what we as academics see as relevant and what, for example, sustainable entrepreneur or user innovator seems relevant. So this final thing is really, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the project where we kind of We bring the things that we identified within the literature, within academic discourse, back to the people, so to say. Could we jump to the next slide? So what I'm going to be introducing is kind of background material that we had go to this open conference with users. So this was more kind of the top-down perspective. It was a systematic review of the literature that was written about user innovation within sustainability and also entrepreneurship in related policy. And then it was afterwards interview with policymakers to see what kind of knowledge did they have about this phenomenon. Was it something that was being discussed at different levels of government, or was it something that was off the policymakers' radars? So to the next slide. What we did when we did our literature review was try to subdivide the role that the users took upon themselves when engaging in this innovation process, and also look at what kind of innovation did they develop. This was looking at what other academics studying this phenomena had observed. And another theme is that there were two capacities in which the end user, the consumer, was brought into the sustainable innovation practice. It was independently, so where the end user develops a novel idea, or it was in what we call facilitated capacity. So that is what looked like if, for example, a firm or project users in to kind of get user-side knowledge to make both products, but also get maybe develop better ideas. What also looked at was what of innovations emerged respectively when looking at kind of the independent versus facilitated side of it. And we divided into this incremental, novel, and system innovation. Basically, incremental is a small improvement upon an existing innovation, while a system innovation is kind of a really radical change to an overall system. An example of that could, for example, be a community power service or a localized food system. And in between those two, we have the idea of a novel product or service. So something that's not just a small improvement upon an existing product, but is a new idea of a new way of using it, or a completely novel product. And one of the most interesting things was that we observed that when you get independent user innovation versus the facilitated, we saw a lot more of kind of really out of the box thinking, kind of very systematic, system-oriented innovation change. When looking at the facilitated, it was very much more incremental. So we got this idea that maybe because they operate in different contexts, they have different frameworks from which they operate from. Slide, please. So the kind of idea that we had, we tried to go through the literature again, and indeed what we observed was that it appears that when pursue innovation, it makes a big difference whether they are placed within a company or project format, or whether they are placed, or whether they pursue something on their own, especially in terms of both solutions pursued, but also kind of the outcome thereof. And what I think the interesting thing is this from a policy perspective, it also means that you have to greatly differentiate whether you want to promote kind of innovation by the individual user by themselves in their own context, whether you want to promote it in a project or say within a firm or a larger project. And looking at it, we just that independent user innovation is very interesting, because what emerges from there is these kind of very radical innovations that can really change the system. And this is also why we chose to focus more on them, because policies out there to support this kind of very niche or small scale innovation is almost non-existent. And that all kind of translates over to the Open Innovation Exchange that was hosted by Cranfield. Next slide, please. In terms of barriers, as you can see, there is great differences between the two. When you look at the independent perspective, it was all about end users not having the skills or the time or the technical know-how to basically execute the ideas that they had. You heard that people had a great idea for a new product or a new service, but they simply didn't know how to make that idea become a reality. In any format, this was very much different because the initiator of the innovation was inherently the project or firm. So you were brought in, but they were in some way a capacity to kind of act, to give feedback, to see what would be done to make this product more intuitive, and then sometimes kind of would they change the given format. They would often offer feedback. The engineers would take that knowledge, change it, and then bring it back to the users again. While the independent context, the end user was left to their own basis because of their context to pursue these changes. In terms of policy, this means that we try to tackle independent innovation on behalf of the user. You look at how can you develop know-how, how can you get access to resources they wouldn't otherwise have, and even excellent examples of where firms basically make it difficult to innovate their own products by making concepts that are so difficult to take apart that it's impossible for any user to actually change upon the given product that he has bought. And final thing that I think is very interesting from a policy perspective is there is also, in some terms, a fear of selling out when a user has developed a new idea. We see this especially with system innovation, is the idea that their little local food market or community project should be somehow commercialized was often seen as something very negative and not something that should happen. And that is not something you would hear from a firm or a project. Next slide, please. So these findings, and we also came with a number of policy recommendations. We tried to see whether policymakers could relate to these observations, whether innovation or sustainable entrepreneurship was something that they faced in their everyday lives. And we tried to find policymakers at different levels, tried to find out how often did they have this terminology in their everyday, and how often did they have anything to do with it when to implement policy. And what we found was that basically at a very low level there was a lack of knowledge about the phenomenon, but also an idea of there was what it actually means. Everyone had heard about, for example, co-creation, but what exactly that meant often meant it meant different things for different people, and that led to a somewhat strange observation is that policymakers were in some way aware that this phenomenon was happening, but they observed it to be a cute phenomenon, something that was nice to observe, or it was very sweet that this guy made this specific product. But when it came to actual policy to promote this, they say, this is not worth our time. We don't see how this little invention from this little guy in, for Bristol, can translate into businesses, turnover, jobs, and welfare creation. So that was one of the big resistances from policymakers, was that there was a basic lack of belief in the idea. But this is what policymakers say. I'll now hand it over to my colleagues, because from another point of view, what is it that users say about the policy ideas that we came with?
Mark, if you can, thank you. Just going to the next slide, that's great. Thank you very much for that really comprehensive introduction. We are focusing on the independent, the individual entrepreneur. So that was the key point that I just want to make on that slide. If you want to just please. Formative and preliminary data collection and literary research. We brought together this live of the Sustainability Entrepreneur, which comprises of 6 interconnected stages for the Sustainability Entrepreneur, starting with education, moving through networks, funding, scaling up, impact, and open policy making. The key, however, is that they are all interrelated and impact on one another. We used this to develop the social media enabled conference, next slide please, which is the Sustainability Innovation Exchange. And this is just a quick summary. We did have 150 people from 40 countries. It was extremely global, lots of fast moving discussions all typed around those 6 topics, with a couple of one at the beginning and at the end, and massive of very useful information in the form of 1,700 unique comments. Next slide, please. And a quick shot, just if you hadn't been able to join us, so that you can see exactly. Obviously, you won't be able to read it all, but just an idea, a visual of it, because it was all text-based, but lots of discussion on polls, guest contributors involved, and a very dynamic and busy day. Next slide, please. So the actual recommendations that we then drew from all that discussion, all that data, and also obviously all the research that went before. Our first recommendations sit with education, and of course that's at the life cycle really. It's where most sustainability entrepreneurs would start. Clearly a vital area in encouraging young people to become those sustainable entrepreneurs of the future. And people really felt there needed to be more training, both formal and informal, to equip those young people to become sustainable entrepreneurs. It was so very much that current business and management education still focuses on profit predominantly and not the triple bottom line of people, planet and profit. And entrepreneurship training also generally lacks a sustainability focus. Policy recommendation then is to align sustainability and entrepreneurship in strategic frameworks, such as the Bologna process, which is a European qualifications framework, and also propose a second funding round to support the further development of university educators for sustainable development via lifelong learning and Erasmus academic work. And then secondly, we recognise that Erasmus is a really key instrument to inform education and training. So our recommendation is to broaden Erasmus in 3 ways. Firstly, we're looking to broaden out the Erasmus for Young Entrepreneur scheme, which already exists. This brings to potential entrepreneurs with existing successful entrepreneurs who act as their hosts. But we have specific sections aimed both at potential and successful sustainable entrepreneurs to encourage greater participation from the sustainability field. Second, there are joint master's programmes already funded by Erasmus Plus, which allow students to study at more than one university and gain valuable experience of a cross-cultural degree. We've had much more emphasis on sustainability and entrepreneurship in the annual work calls for funding. There are plenty of really exciting joint masters around marine conservation and lots of many sustainable topics. Sustainability and entrepreneurship given promotion and included in many more of these. And we would want the economic forum skills for the 21st century to be included in innovation criteria for these joint masters. Next slide. So WIL is networks, where we have 2 recommendations. They're in their own slightly independent theme. But our first network theme, thank you, is entrepreneurial ecosystems. So many entrepreneurs told us how important the network had been for them in providing support, both practical but also emotional, and that sense of solidarity. And networks have often emerged through virtual networks, cluster hubs, maybe local communities, crowdfunding or crowdfunding platforms, and many other places. People connect with people, unsurprisingly, more than with institutions. The proposal is for the existing EU and innovation centres to engage more in the field of sustainability, for also for a new knowledge and innovation centre to be created to connect those communities and networks which already exist, entrepreneurs, to connect them to academia and industry. Support scaling up. We feel that innovations don't need to be completely new. Good can also be replicated. As Christians, there's lots of ways to innovation. Please. Thank you. The second theme, also based in networks, around the power of stories. So many people we spoke with said how powerful and inspiring and insightful story existing successful entrepreneurs are. So we really wanted to capitalise upon that. Sorry. The Enterprise Europe network holds many case stories already, and some of these come from sectors very closely linked with sustainability, the sustainable construction industry, agro-food and intelligent energy sectors amongst them. The foundation here is for a Horizon 2020 grant to pan-European consortium to promote and expand the network with more new SME and micro-enterprise members and, of course, spaces. We saw benefit to these cases, and education materials also, which links back to our education theme, and we thought they could be promoted within the Erasmus Joint Masters Providers Scheme. So more benefit could be taken from those, and that information could be shared. I'll hand over to my colleague Rosina, who will take you through further recommendations.
So moving on to the funding stage of the life cycle, excuse me. Unsurprisingly, we found amongst our sustainable entrepreneurs that took part in the event that accessing funding represents a barrier to many of them. And that this wasn't actually due to a lack of funding, but a failure of finding matches between potential funders and entrepreneurs. We identified 3 issues for this stage in the life cycle, and make a policy recommendation for each. The first is the current financial system fails investments which deliver financial profit at a relatively short timescale. So this makes it much harder for entrepreneurs who, whilst they may have a financially viable business opportunity, are also balancing that profitability with other valuable impacts, either social or environmental. So the question was, how can we help to make sure that both public and private funding flows towards these ventures or prioritises them over more traditional businesses? And we argue that the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund are in helping to prioritise this type of funding. That's the next slide. What we were saying is that we think that there are instruments that exist there already, but what needs to be happened is that they're rebalanced and more strongly targeted towards sustainable innovation, so that the funding criteria, so the way in which they decide who the fund goes to, is driven not just by future profitability, but social and environmental impacts. And with specific schemes that are there that could be done with, but also that could be applied more generally to European Bank and European Investment Fund products. Next. And still funding, the second theme came up is the opportunity that crowdfunding might represent for linking individual investors to entrepreneurs. Next. Felt that crowdfunding could be particularly helpful for entrepreneurs because people vote their wallet, which align with their own personal values and convictions. There was an agreement from the participants that crowdfunding was a useful method for getting seed funding, but normally had to access additional sources of funds on top of that to take their businesses to scale. So, next slide, please. Want to fund more research into crowdfunding and specifically how the EU can leverage crowdfunding to drive sustainable innovation. The Commission's already got a crowdfunding stakeholder forum which would be well placed to conduct this research, and we think they should report on best practice already out there in terms of specific platforms for sustainability-oriented projects, crowdfunding projects. So one called EcoCrowd in Germany, but also instances where governments have financed sustainability projects through crowdfunding platforms. So we're saying we can report on best practice and really try and grow, build examples where that's worked successfully in both those instances. And research is needed into whether there's a EU regulatory framework to protect investors, because one of the issues with crowdfunding is it's argued that there isn't enough investor protection. If there's been regulation put in place to further protect investors, and we think research needs to be done on whether that could help unleash crowdfunding as an opportunity in the EU. Next slide, please. The final recommendation within funding is around the opportunity of corporate venturing. So there are big businesses such as Unilever and Google, which have corporate venturing arms. They already have sustainability criteria at the forefront of their decision-making strategies around who they invest in. We're calling this giant green incubators because we believe there's quite a lot of money available to flow from these corporate venturing arms, and we believe that policy should be designed to try and encourage that funding to flow towards sustainable projects. So recommending here, sorry, the wording's quite complicated, is basically a vehicle which allows the European Investment Bank to co-finance those sorts of projects with, for example, Unilever Ventures or Google Ventures. Co-financing schemes already exist, but they tend to work alongside traditional venture capitalists on these corporate venture capital arms. We think that there's opportunity for a vehicle that specifically finances with corporate venture capital arms to help unlock some of this investment. I'm going to pass back to Christine to talk about next recommendation.
Thank you, thanks. The next thing is both to funding and scaling up. And what we found, next slide, please, was that many sustainability entrepreneurs want to achieve social and environmental goals as well as profit. They have a mix or hybrid motivation, and it calls different legal form to fit these different goals. Different legal forms that already exist, such as charitable limited liability companies, community enterprises, and so on. We're proposing a single legal form for sustainable ventures across the EU, so that these organisations are recognised and are readily comparable. We feel that this could aid and facilitate funding, as funders would be aided by a legal form that they recognise with key definitions. And the For Benefits Corporation, or it's been abbreviated to B Corp, all exist as a legal form in a number of countries worldwide, and do exist in Italy currently as a legal form. There's generally a voluntary, non-legal type of membership association in much of Europe currently. Something that the B Corp legal form formalised across the EU, and we recognise that the Societas Europaea framework could be modified to deliver this. I'll hand over to my colleague Hugh Wilson. Slide.
I see various people on the screen. Can you put a thumbs up if you can hear me? Rosina or Simon? Good, Simon can hear me. Thank you. So far we have been talking about increasing the flow of new businesses, of entrepreneurs, of user entrepreneurs who are sustainable, and growing those businesses, scaling them up. However, also an extent to which policymakers want to think top-down. Plus Union, plus indeed the world have got some pretty stretching carbon targets, for example, by 2050 to reduce by 80% in terms of household carbon. And would be lovely if, from a policymaker's perspective, you could compare apples with pears and work out which of all these sorts of innovation you were going to encourage. All the case studies, for example, that have been done by other work packages within the EU-InnovatE project. We have whole categories of different types of innovation intended to reduce transport use through things like car sharing. We have electric car innovations. We have innovations like solar cells on people's roofs, and we have cooperative living sorts of innovations. Each of those we call an innovation type. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could put that into a kind of sausage machine, include kind of average impact that the innovations have for every household that adopts them? Also into the sausage machine details of the countries, such as how many households there are and what sizes are, and how green the electric grid is. And it would be lovely if we could also put in as a third kind of variable into the sausage machine, many people are adopting each of these innovations. What percentage of the population so far, for example, has got solar cells on their roofs, and how fast is that growing? Now, an interesting thing about that variable is, of course, it can be influenced by policy, because, right, for example, some countries have got policies for particulation types. In the United Kingdom, for example, have got policies to encourage solar cells on roofs. Well, we've built such a sausage machine, or to be accurate, our colleagues in Cranfield under Professor Liz have built such a sausage machine for this project, where you put in these inputs and out comes the state's household carbon to 2050. That's really useful. Could you go on to the next slide for a second, please, Marco? The thing that enables you to say is, as a policymaker, whether it's at state level or EU level or indeed at city level, let's look at which categories of innovation are most effective. This chart, for example, shows UK versus Germany versus Spain, and more particular categories of innovation. And we've seen 10 categories in the case studies we've looked at for the EU-InnovatE project. And this compares the impact of each of these innovations on total carbon from the state if everyone were to adopt it by 2050. You can see whereas cooperative living styles, that's models such as several people in a block of apartments sharing some facilities such as this, that has a big impact on total carbon, whatever country you're in. The photovoltaic cells on the roof, solar cells as they're often called, they have a big impact in the United Kingdom. In Spain, they have a somewhat lesser impact, partly because the weather is different, and partly because there's already quite a bit of carbon coming onto the grid that can't quite be utilized by the grid from that particular source. Look at the last bars on electric cars. The situation is even more extreme, whereas in Spain, electric cars are seriously useful in reducing household carbon. Within the United Kingdom, because our grid isn't green enough yet, every electric car adopted has actually a negative effect on carbon according to our models. This kind of model is seriously useful for our policymakers deciding what kind of innovations to incentivize the adoption for. So if you can just move on to the next slide, please, Marco. We recommend that policymakers at each level of aggregation, from the European Union to cities, use such a model so they take conscious choices as to what kind of emerging types of innovation is useful and need encouraging through tax breaks or any other form of incentive. Okay, would you move on to the next slide, and I will hand over.
Just picking up the final recommendation 10, this is in the middle of the survey where we've labelled it open policy making. So this is not so much about the stages of the life cycle from an entrepreneur's point of view, it's about how policy itself is made. And as Christian spoke at the beginning about this facilitated innovation type thing that private companies are doing, where they're trying to listen more stakeholders in order to make better decisions about innovations, suggesting that perhaps policymakers should consult, listen to, and take account the opinions of their stakeholders who are their citizens. And this is in effect what we did with the Sustainability Innovation Exchange. We tried to show that you might be able to make better decisions around policy through engaging with citizens and other stakeholders. Next slide. Workshops that we ran, Ida Auken, who was the former Danish Minister for the Environment, told us a brilliant story about how her open ministry approach helped her to a better climate adaptation policy in her country. And we think there's much to be learned from these sorts of examples that already exist. So again, our recommendation is for new research into this phenomenon of open policy making or open innovation in the public policy. We think that there's real value in looking at some examples of how this has worked in the past in order to recommend that more platforms that allow citizen involvement and engagement in policy making can be put successfully in place. And just along the bottom there, those logos represent some of these initiatives that are already taking place in various places around the world, which we could draw on. So that brings us to the end of our 10 policy recommendations. If we just have a look at the last slide, this summarises those 10 recommendations that we've gone through with the following areas around the circle. This concludes our presentation of a background to the project and the policy recommendations coming out of it. So we'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. Apologies that we've run over time.
Well, I don't think apologies are necessary. They're always appreciated. But I mean, again, the work that's gone on in Work Package 6 has really been extraordinary in its breadth. And I think the presentation from all of you today has just highlighted the different areas that you've been touching on, and more importantly, the scale and the variety of different ideas about how policy making can be a far more innovative and effective actor in emerging phenomenon. We simply need to make sure that these start to reach the right audiences, because I think that they're profoundly important against the backdrop of the crises of youth unemployment, of relatively low growth, concerns about long-term competitiveness in Europe, as well as wider concerns about sustainability. So there's a huge richness of information and insight here. So what we will do now is just unmute everybody's microphones in the hope that we don't get a tummy of background noise from wherever you may be. Basically, the floor to anybody who would like to ask a question. We have somebody who's talking in the background. I'm not sure if that's you. By the way, anybody who would like to ask a question to any of the presenters or raise any comments on the recommendations or other points raised, please feel free to do so now.
Well, I have a kind of question for my colleagues, if I can, Simon.
Yeah, of course, you.
There was a meeting a couple of weeks ago in Brussels with some policymakers discussing some of these recommendations, and I wondered if any of those here present have any reflections coming out of that meeting on the issue you've just raised, Simon, the journey from here as to how these recommendations can be communicated to those who would wish to hear them.
Shall I say something? My feeling is that we probably need to utilise the people and leverage from those that we did speak with, because actually encourage them to disseminate what we spoke about, but also to request direct contacts where appropriate in relevant departments, so that we can start to form some relationships and start to disseminate some of the information directly, because that may be the way forward, where we could be encourage others to see the benefit of some of the recommendations that we're proposing along the lines that Simon mentioned, in terms of, if they have the goals of reducing youth unemployment, for example. So that was my feeling.
I think it also kind of becomes clear how enormously complex policy making is when you look at it at a European or national level. I mean, just from the feedback we got from policymakers, there was a lot of these initiatives that we hadn't heard about or we weren't aware of, and I mean, we of course did our best to follow these initiatives, but still we were, as relatively competent researchers, unable to identify some of the realms in where we ourselves have written about. So I think that kind of shows how, in some way, murky the water is within the policy domain, that initiatives that are very effective 5 years ago kind of go off the radar and then just kind of lie there dormantly. And it is exactly the kind of initiative that we recommended, but we couldn't find it because it got lost in a policy mess or a policy jungle.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. It's the open policy making key there, in the fact that we found, subsequent to a lot of research, that organisations which we were suggesting should exist already existed, or were already in touch with departments that we were suggesting they should be put in touch with. So I think that more that citizens and innovators can be engaged with policy making, actually the more joined up that making could be, more effective it could be.
So from our side, I think there are probably 3 bullet points. The first is that we always have to keep in mind that there is policy and then there's politics, and it's really straightforward to run a process to create kind of insights and recommendations that have material relevance for people who are working on the policy process. But it's also then quite difficult, as we also had around the table, to get the political influencers and shapers to hear these messages. What's a very, very cluttered bandwidth, if you like. And obviously, without political will, there's relatively little that happens on the policy level beyond basic administration and process. So I think it's a challenge to all of us involved in the project, and then others who see a really viable interest in supporting this sort of movement and calls for more action and investment in sustainable entrepreneurship and citizen innovation. Try and find those points of political connection. If you can get those, then you start a very different dialogue than you would with, I don't know, administrators, but people who are working on the central directions of policy and regulation. And I think that's going to be one of our challenges going forward. Having said that, I think the work that's been done in WP6 is phenomenal, and the fact that these recommendations are so closely aligned or directly aligned with things that really exist. I mean, they're not pipe dreams or pure aspirations. There are points of contact in the European Investment Bank and in the European Commission and elsewhere. We can take these findings and try and engage in a more constructive dialogue to say this is what we think would really be a contribution to future work programs, initiatives, funding allocation, etc. Can we do? Because then I think this opens up a realm of new opportunities for groups as ours in the EU-InnovatE project and others, start bringing a lot of new insights and creative thinking and innovative partnership platforms, whether those are much focused on education or innovation and practice, those into more supportive spaces. And then I think we've got some real momentum. I'm conscious that we're up on 4 o'clock, but let me ask again, are there any other Participants who'd like to raise a question, make a comment, or any kind of feedback. No? Okay. Well, it's a little difficult for it to be but that's okay. I mean, listen, we'll just move very quickly on to the last couple of slides. One message that we want to pass along is that we will be having the final conference for the EU-InnovatE project on November the 22nd here in Brussels. It will be hosted at the former Wine Palace, or Trade Fair in Brussels, the Atelier des Tanneurs. And we will be using this event for very creative, inclusive, and dynamic conference to really explore the different pathways that we could adopt as a community of practitioners, of entrepreneurs, of policymakers, academics, and others to start celebrating the, I think we can still call it that. And as part of the wide ambitions for long-term sustainability in Europe. I hasten to add there are no conference fees involved, and there are also partial travel subsidies available for participants. So we strongly recommend that you go to the EU-InnovatE website, sign online, and we hope very much that you'll be able to join us in a little over a month's time, where we share the final outcomes of the project, but above all, focus very much on this multi-stakeholder dialogue about how to move this agenda forward through policy, through business, through communities, and also through education and scholarship. With that, I would like to extend our sincere thanks, and also on behalf of participants, to Christine, Rosina, thank you for all of the work that you put in, not just to this presentation, but everything went into preparing the policy roundtable, where this really formed a very rich set of conversations with European policymakers. I'd like to thank you, the participants, for taking the time out of your afternoons to join this conversation. And as mentioned at the beginning, the slides and the audio from today's webinar will be made available on the EU-InnovatE website in the very near future. You also go online and download files from the previous webinars we've had in the series, and we hope that those provide some very productive food for thought in weeks and months to come. So I'll bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you again for your time and your participation, and look forward to being in touch with you again soon. Thank you and goodbye for now.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye. Bye.